Morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday morning. I have been accumulating comics for the last month or so, and I need to start filing some of these things away. So this is the time when I'm going to go through and share some of what I found, and figured I would put these out there. I know this is one of those videos I always enjoy seeing, kind of weird comics and stuff I haven't heard of, and even stuff I have heard of, but maybe through the lens of someone else's perspective. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's look at some comics for an hour or so on this beautiful Sunday morning. Yeah. Hey, David. Yes. Hello, fellow nerds, I guess is another way to say all this. This may be live later on. It kind of depends on how everything goes. And I'm going to start with a good one here. So this is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Secret of the Ooze. This is the movie adaptation of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles second movie, and this has been on my list for a while because it is done by, well, it's drawn by Jim Lawson. He's done a lot of great turtle art. I like his version of the Turtles, but why this was on my radar is Richmond Lewis, who colored Batman Year One, and who I think of as one of the great colorists, but has not done a lot of comics coloring, is the colorist on this one. So I came across this recently. I was delighted to see it in person and grabbed it right away. And you can see these colors are very reminiscent of Batman Year One, the collected version, the painted version. If you compare the original publication of Batman Year One to the collected edition, they're two different color jobs. Same colorist, but two different color jobs, two different color processes. And this one looks very in line with the painted, revised Batman Year One color version. So kind of neat to see this. You can see her approach to different scenes having different palettes. Something that was a little bit ahead of the time. I feel like this is kind of a standard approach now, but was a little bit different then, and obviously using a much wider palette than what you would see in the traditional four-color palette that Marvel and DC used through, the 60s, 70s, 80s, part of the 90s. Pretty cool to see. And Jim Lawson's art looks great. Very fun layouts. A lot of stuff that you don't see as much anymore in kind of standard comics, but pretty exciting. Very nice book for a movie adaptation. Those things tend to range quite a bit. We've looked at some different movie adaptations in the past, and we may do that again because they're kind of an interesting novelty, at least as far as I'm concerned. And there have definitely been some good ones, so pretty good here. I think there might be an Archie, like a newsstand version of this second movie adaptation. And if anybody knows about that, please fill in the gaps here, because if there is a second version of this, I would be curious to check that out and see what it looks like. Hey, Gregory, thanks for the super chat, man. So the other comic that I tend to talk about quite a bit on this show are some of the ninja comics from the 80s. Picked up a few of those. This is Whisper. This is Stephen Grant's ninja comic. I compare it a little bit to Elektra Assassin because it is a woman ninja, and it's of that same time period, mid to late 80s. I think this series ran into around 35, 36 issues, something around there. Had several different interesting artists come through, including Norm Brayfogle, who we've been talking about a little bit on the Wizard coverage, one of the artists I like. But honestly, all the artists that I've seen in Whisper are quite strong, and it's a really good comic. It's very of the 80s, and by that I mean things like there's attention to fashion, so it looks like, at this point, it looks like a period piece. And those kinds of details are something I appreciate more and more. Whenever I go back and pick up an issue of this, there's always good fight actions. The stories are interesting. Running for over 3 years, you can imagine it covers quite a few story arcs. So good art, good stories, good character. I endorse Whisper. I'm a couple issues away from completing my run of that. And then I'm going to call attention to Crossroads, which is also Stephen Grant and Cynthia Martin, who, if you Wikipedia her, she's known for drawing some of Marvel's Star Wars comics late in the Star Wars run. I like this one a lot. I am not very familiar with Cynthia Martin before I picked up this book, but I really like the art in this one too. And this Crossroads was something that First Publishing did, where they would team up like 2 of their characters or 3 of their characters. So it's kind of a gimmick series, but this one's pretty good. John Sable and Whisper actually fit together pretty well. You can also see a very different approach to color, talking about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Richmond Lewis. Most of the indie companies that would spring up would have some different coloring approach compared to the Marvel DC 4-color style. And so you can see some of that here. I think that's airbrushed probably on like a blue line method, and who knows, maybe we'll do an episode sometime where we get really into coloring and talk about some of the coloring processes of the time. All right, another ninja comic that I talk about quite a bit. This is like the third Ninja Woman of the 80s characters. This is Blade of Shuriken. This book, or this character, ran through quite a few series, mini-series, one-shots, different comics, from self-publishing by Reggie Byers, the the creator and the frequent writer and artist. And this one is, I believe this is created, written, and drawn by Reggie Byers. As this series would go through different publishers and different iterations, different artists would come on board, different writers would come on board, which, pretty standard if you're coming from American comics. You see it in Marvel and DC, where different creators are constantly putting their spin on characters. There's a great ad for Carnage. If you've ever heard Ed talk about Carnage, this is one of those fun black and white early books that Ed came across probably at too young of an age. But it's one of those titles that I love from the black and white explosion era, violent, post-apocalyptic. It's half B-movie, half video game, and all fun. Only one issue of this was published as far as I know. Fun to see that ad, really puts you in a certain time period. But Reggie Byers, his background, besides self-publishing, he did early Robotech comics. And I guess that's how he set up his own publishing company. And then Shuriken was his main character whenever he was publishing under Victory. Eventually Malibu bought that. You can see these are published by Eternity, which was like a imprint or a subsidiary of Malibu. I think that's the way it was set up. So I always think I think Marvel might own this character based on buying Malibu in 1994. I don't know that to be completely true. I don't know that Shuriken has ever appeared in a Marvel comic, but that's if I'm doing a grand design at Marvel, if you're watching, Shuriken, if that's on the table, let me know. These are fun comics though, and like I said, they do run quite a range. Reggie Byers, one of the early probably American cartoonists where you could really see the anime manga influence. And, it comes through in this character, came through in Robotech, and some of the other artists who would go on and do a version of Shuriken. Here's another issue. This one not done by Reggie Byers, created by Byers, but Wes Abbott is the illustrator. And I think, in my opinion, this one looks even more like a manga art style. So pretty interesting work for that time period. This is 1991, so a couple of years after the Whisper comics that I was just showing off. And then these are a couple of pretty random issues. I have the comics that I'm going to be going through in this video have come from all over the place. 4-Color Fantasy, New Dimension, Copacetic, Ides. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. It'll probably come to me. But I've just kind of accumulated this pile of comics from a number of sources. And so as Ed is getting ready to return to the States, I realize I need to clean up all of my comics and be ready to start going with, I think he's bringing back several suitcases of books. So I wanted to just go through this stack. And as we go through, you're going to see quite a wide variety of material here. Phantom of the Attic was another store that I grabbed a couple of these, and probably a few are things that people have given me, and a few are from SPX. So bear with me. They cover a range from people who have given me a couple of these books that are in this pile to also quarter sales, 50-cent sales, dollar sales, possibly something, a book or two off of eBay. I'm not even sure. They've been piling up for maybe 4 to 6 weeks. So we'll see where it goes. If there's anything specific, I'll try to call out if there's anything noteworthy in where some of this stuff came from. So a lot of it's somewhat random. You know, Biff Bang Pow. I don't really know this series. I found this in some, mix up of a box. The cover stood out. I think I've heard of that, but I wasn't sure why. And then whenever I look through the table of contents, you'll see like Ivan Brunetti, Jessica Abel. Those two I both think of as Chicago artists. This is 1992, so for alternative cartoonists, this is kind of a maybe a second generation of alternative cartoonists, but very early on. You can see that's pretty interesting if you think of like Image comics of that time period. And then Intrazone, #1, Brainstorm Comics. I like the way this inside looks. I think this is marker, probably, some of this background. I don't know that would be an ink wash. And that's 1993, Farmingdale, New York. So you can see a little bit of like an Image Comics influence at that time. Pen line ink. Post-apocalyptic, always popular in comics, at least the comics from my childhood, with some mechs, so maybe a little bit of that manga anime influence at the time. Sweet Lucy is a comic that I've also seen, so this one definitely made it. These are some of the other, I guess, planned titles for Brainstorm Comics. I don't know whether all of them made it or not. Night School was a vampire comic. I don't think I've seen Night School, so like I said, not sure. You see these ads and everybody's very ambitious, but not everything that's advertised actually makes it to print. I was Zoru, updating us a little bit on that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie adaptation comic, colored by Barry Grossman, and looks like typical flat coloring. Well, thanks for answering that. Yeah, that's something I'd be curious to just kind of compare and contrast. I always think it's interesting to see the same, I guess, line art, but interpreted by different colorists. So, all right, this is the Moth special from Dark Horse. Rocket Comics, I guess, was a brief imprint. Everybody was doing those imprints. There was, I think, Shock Rocket may have been like Kurt Busiek at Image, and a few of those guys. Dark Horse obviously had Legend Comics. I think this is a little bit later on. This says 03 for the cover, so almost a decade after Legend, I suppose. But this is Steve Rude. Steve Rude, known for Nexus, one of the best figure artists probably in comics history. Nexus is the big one, and you can always find those in back issue bins. One of the better alternative superhero comics of the 80s for sure, and a lot of that is Steve Rude's influence. But this is another character that he had invented, and this came out of the Creator Universe cards. And Gary Martin, a frequent inker of Steve Rude's, is like the writer of this. And this is the card art from the Creator Universe card set, which we've talked about on the Wizard back issues. I think it's from probably 1993. A bunch of cartoonists would just do their own characters. I'm sure inspired by something like Wizard, or Image Comics startup and their success, but a quicker, I hate to say money grab, but it's much faster to draw, a card art than it is to draw an entire comic book, and a lot less financial risk for whoever's publishing it. So the Moth was one of the characters Steve Rude drew in the card universe, and Gary Martin responded to that artwork and I guess basically pitched Steve Rude on doing let's do some comics with this character. And so this is a little background from Gary Martin, an intro as to how this came about. And there have been a few Moth comics, miniseries and things. And you can see, you know, Steve Rude's just really great. This character I don't think caught on. He's kind of an acrobat out of like a circus, but very nice to look at. And, you know, I probably picked this up for 50 cents or so. No regrets there. I have some of the other Moth comics. It's the same deal, you know, they're just very pretty to look at. So if you come across a Steve Rude comic, if you're unfamiliar with Steve Rude and you come across one, definitely pick it up just to check it out. You know, one of the great figure artists of American comics, and because so much of his work is in Nexus, you know, outside of that Marvel DC world, you don't see as much, you know, you may not get the credit that he's due. So somebody you could possibly compare him a little bit to a Dave Stevens, the creator of Rocketeer, another guy who really was at the top echelon of that figure fetish style art. Steve Rude would fit perfectly in that kind of context. And he has done work for Marvel and DC, of course. You know, you can find some of that, but definitely Nexus, the thing that he's known for. And The Moth, good looking kind of offbeat series. Never really caught on, but it could have been the time period when it was published also. That early 2000s was kind of a tough time for self-publishing, maybe a tough time for any comics publishing, if you think about it. This is a random issue of Cerebus. I think I picked this up because of the cover. I used to have all the Cerebus trade paperbacks, the phone books as he would call it. I got rid of them at some point, probably for space, or, you know, I hadn't read them in years and years. And now I've slowly been buying Cerebus in issues. At different times in Cerebus history, it really sold in big numbers, you know, for an alternative comic. And so these are titles that I find, or these are issues that I find in back issue bins frequently. Dave Sim, you know, personal politics aside, is a very good cartoonist and a very important one historically, especially as a self-publisher. I recently did that lettering video. Dave Sim is one of the great comic book letterers I've ever seen. So I enjoy flipping through and just kind of marveling at the level of craft. And for a long time, he was just one of the great storytellers. You know, some of the early Cerebus stories like Church and State really kind of changed, I think, the way a lot of people looked at what comics could be. It was just much more ambitious storytelling than what we were seeing in your typical comic book. Funny, interesting, you know, I don't know about genre defying, but definitely outside of, you know, what you would see in a superhero comic, and people just reacted, you know, they responded to it. It was really great cartooning. So interesting to you know, pick these up, especially, again, whenever you find them for a quarter or 50 cents, and you can find a lot of Cerebus stuff. A lot of them would run, like he would run interesting stuff in the back, like previews for other self-published books. He ran several 24-hour comic excerpts around like the 150 issues or so, whenever that became a trendy-ish thing. So like Scott McCloud and Neil Gaiman and Steve Bissette, I think he ran 24-hour comic excerpts from all those guys. So interesting cartoonist, obviously. You're probably familiar with Dave Sim. I've gotten into his Glamour Puss comics lately, and like, you know, really kind of wild. All right, so this is Curtis Comics. I don't know how many people are familiar with Curtis Comics, but these are Korean comics, and let's see, the English version is 2002, the original version is 1995. I don't know how many issues, how many titles Curtis Comics published, maybe a dozen or so. Again, that 2002 time period is really kind of a tough time period, I think, for, you know, any comics to get going. Everybody's always sort of trying this. But they have a couple of, most of their series ran, I think, 1 or 2 issues. And weirdly, a lot of the number 2 issues would run the same exact cover as issue 1, with the only difference being the issue number, which, you know, you can see is very small and not distinct. There's not even a box around it. So a couple of the ones that I have, I like. One is called Moon, and it's about this gang. And I've been actually looking for issue 2 of that. As far as I know, issue 2 exists, but I have not found it in person, and I haven't ordered it online. The few places where I have found these in back issue bins, I think they often don't have an issue 2 because it looks like issue 1. So I don't know. It's a bizarre choice. I don't know if it was a production error or what. I don't know why you would ever run, you know, an almost identical cover for an issue 2. But these are clearly, you know, there's some manga storytelling similarities, but these are out of Korea. So I don't know. Interesting artifacts. Curtis Comics, as far as I know, you know, only published 20 comics maybe. And here you can see, so these are some of their other titles. Not a great ad. Here is Moon, which is the one I was interested in. But, you know, like this one is a racing comic. They're kind of all genre, high concept genre comics. So it's an oddity. Let's put it that way. Terminator, Burning Earth, number 1 of 5. This is a pretty famous book. If you see the signature here, Alexander, that is Alexander Ross before he did Marvels and became, you know, what we all know as Alex Ross. I think this was the last big title he did before he did Marvels and exploded into the superstar that we know him as now. I see these Burning Earth miniseries every once in a while. I don't know what made me decide to pull the trigger on this one. It might have been like 10 comics for $5 or something, and I needed another one. But I enjoy seeing his work. It's a little bit rougher. It's not as, I guess, photo reference. Maybe didn't have, page rate wise, didn't have the time or resources to really build up models and spend time with that. But you can still see Alex Ross, you know, what he's going to become. You can see glimpses of it here. So kind of cool to see this. Now had the Terminator license for a long time. They did a regular series of Terminator comics that would have like a Mitch O'Connell covers that were really cool covers. The interiors, I don't remember them standing out too much. But of course, this one noteworthy for Alex Ross's involvement. GI Combat, number 237. Are you guys scratching your head at this one? The reason that I've been buying GI Combat issues is they have a ninja character. So a ninja sizzler, Sword of Blood. This is an anthology war comic. This one's from 1982. I don't know if Joe Kubert was the editor of these, but it's those types of books. Yeah, not Joe Kubert, but I always think of these as like Joe Kubert war books. And sometimes you'll find some really good artists in these things, like Russ Heath or artist of that caliber, sometimes Joe Kubert himself. But the reason that I've been tracking some of these down is definitely for the early ninja comics. Some of them go back even a couple of years before this. And I don't know if they're great ninja comics, but they're noteworthy to me. And this is the story. This is the Sword of Blood. But they are some of the earliest American ninja comics as far as I know. So that's how they got onto my radar. And he probably has, I don't know, 15 or 20 appearances scattered over 4 or 5 years. He's not in every issue, so you have to look up which issues contain a ninja story and then track them down. Wizard number half, Sin City, Just Another Saturday Night. I thought I had this book, but this one looked a little bit different to me. So again, 50 cents or $1 or a quarter. I can't remember what any of this stuff was. It's definitely worth a pickup. If I have the exact book, I can always pass it on. But for some reason, I don't know, maybe Wizard did a couple of these issues. Really don't know. Been going back and revisiting a lot of the Sin City stuff recently because we did an episode on Sin City, the first book, and that stuff was some of my favorite comics whenever it was first published. So it's kind of neat to revisit it. You know, it's one of those books, kind of like the Wizard magazines, that I just looked at and looked at and looked at. Tales to Offend is another really fun comic if you come across that. It's all Frank Miller. I think it's in color if memory serves, and it's like, I don't know, weird. Yeah, full color, fully offensive. Lance Blastoff is like this adventure spoof character of Miller's, kind of a throwback to old pulp heroes, but with a kind of 90s postmodern sensibility, I suppose. And this is when Miller was fighting any kind of rating system or anything. There was a lot of talk. If you were reading Sin City in the single issues, the letters columns would often have a fired up Miller talking about anti-rating system, and so was doing work, you know, with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund to try to keep comics free, I suppose. Ambush Bug, Stocking Stuffer. This is going to go great if we ever make an actual Christmas comic episode. I don't know whether we will do that or not, but the reason I picked this one up is Keith Giffen. We've been talking about Keith Giffen. That's a guy, I have not read a lot of his comics, but I have friends who love him, and I hear good things about him. And anytime I see a Keith Giffen article or excerpt or something, it usually looks pretty interesting. Trencher is one that I would read when I was a kid, and that was somewhat atypical, I think, for Keith Giffen. Not a lot of his comics look like Trencher, so this is more what I think of as Keith Giffen comics, and this thing is amazing. It is loaded with all of these like short chapters, different page layouts. I have not read this yet, but flipping through it, I'm on board. Like, I think it looks really incredible and looks like a very entertaining comic. Great lettering throughout, lots of these like title pages for short stories and pieces. How to Write Comic Books Part 12. You know, like, this is part of the comic. So even a Pittsburgh reference there randomly, I think randomly. EC Comics, throwback reference. So kids comics, these would always appear in things like Archie. You know, there'd be like Little Archie. 12-panel grid. I like what I see of the Keith Giffen that I've seen and read. I enjoy, so I think this one's going to be very fun. Every now and then we ask all of you for Keith Giffen recommendations, and usually Michel Fife will point us at certain stuff. This one I haven't heard of. You know, I mean, Ambush Bug, obviously, but this particular Christmas special I hadn't heard of, and looks good. It's weird. I couldn't find any credits inside of here. I mean, obviously this is Giffen, but I don't know who the whole creative team is. Who knows? Maybe this was thrown together quickly, and a lot of people chipped in on things like coloring and lettering. But looks great. These are kind of neat. This came in a 4-pack, and it's Dragon Ball Z. I think I have a trade, like one of those big oversized multi-volumes in one trade book floating around here. I picked this up mostly for the novelty of it. So much of the like Viz Comics that does a lot of manga imports and has been doing that since the 80s. It seems like early on they were trying to figure out formats and the best way to present this material, you know, in the American market. And so you get a lot of different formats, different sizes, you know, trade paperbacks, oversized issues, anthologies, bi-weekly, all kinds of different approaches as to how this best translates. So this is kind of a novelty for me. Whenever I saw it as a 4-pack, I was like, yeah, I'll pick that up and look at it. You know, Dragon Ball Z, one of the big pop cultural nexus points in comics and manga and anime. So kind of cool to flip through this. It's a fight comic, but it's a fight comic that's much more of a cartoonish style. Definitely fun comics. Here's one for you. Atlas Comics. Atlas Comics, we may have to just do an episode on Atlas Comics sometime, because they published a whole bunch of stuff. They poached a lot. I don't know if poached is the right word, but they definitely brought a lot of Marvel DC type of talent over to Atlas Comics whenever they started. They ran for a couple of years in the 70s, and you know, they looked like Marvel DC kind of comics, Charlton, you know, whatever would have been going on at the time. Some of their art teams are fascinating. So the reason this came across my list is it's drawn by Steve Ditko with inks by Bernie Wrightson. I don't know if those guys ever worked together anywhere else. There are also a couple of Atlas comics that Ditko drew that Wally Wood inked. There's also some DC comics like Stalker that Ditko drew and Wally Wood inked. That's a good team. Bernie Wrightson, you know, amazing with as an inker, as an artist, and so it's kind of cool to see those two team up. Like I said, I'm not sure if it happened anywhere else. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff that you find in comics history, these little almost quiet moments, but you know, you think of character team ups often stand out, but why not these great art teams, especially these assembly line teams? And this reminds me a lot of like Dan Clowes' Death Ray. And I know that, you know, Clowes is a big fan of Ditko. That's a great face. Really like that face. Yeah, Destroyer was a Ditko Wood book that Atlas published, and then Stalker was a Ditko Wood book that DC Comics published. It was a barbarian, like sword and sorcery title. Ooh, speaking of Giffen and Lobo, it's pretty rare that I go digging and don't come away with something Lobo. So this is Lobo, Highway to Hell, Scott Ian and Sam Keith. Kind of noteworthy for Scott Ian. I don't know how many comics he has fooled around with or how this book came together, but this is 2010. Interesting that Sam Keith is not the colorist on this, even though some of it you'll see looks a little painterly, but nevertheless, I love how this looks. You know, we talk about what I like about Lobo, and part of it is that mashup between very cartoony and then like, you know, violent image style, steroid, you know, veins and muscles and violence. And Sam Keith is a perfect fit for this. You know, you can see in his cartooning style, it's just a perfect mashup. It's not too different than what he was doing with the Max. You know, art-wise, this one, 20 years later, it certainly looks a little bit different, but in terms of combining kind of this cartoony, absurdist, surreal qualities, he's a good fit. And he had done some Lobo covers in the past, so I don't know if he did any Lobo interiors before this comic, but this is a 2-issue book. I only happened to come upon issue 1. It's a, you know, square bound, like a 48 or 64 page issue, but really great, man. A very good Lobo version in my mind. And I have a couple other Lobos that I picked up. Lobo, I Quit. This is, I think, a one-shot. And the artist on this, I did a Lobo interview for a old DC Comics blog. And it was all about Lobo. And we were talking about all the different artists that would do like Lobo miniseries and one-shots and how good they were at getting good artists. And this is Carlos Esquerra, the longtime 2000 AD cartoonist. At least that's where I think of his work. You know, Judge Dredd artist forever. And guess what? Lobo and Judge Dredd, if you can draw one of them really well, chances are you can draw the other one pretty well. At least that's from the small crossover sample size that we have. I think that is true. And that's the reason that I picked this up. And I like his version of Lobo. I think he looks really great. So, fun issue. Fun character too, that tusk-looking guy. Another good Lobo artist, Martin Emond. He did a few Lobo one-shots, I guess. He did Lobo Cop, which is one of my favorite Lobo comics. I think he did In the Chair, and he may have done maybe another Lobo title or two. Crossover with Deadman. This Deadman reminds me a lot of like Kelly Jones' Deadman. And why not? And this one's kind of, it's not exactly painted, but don't know if he's doing the colors too or not. Yeah, so Martin Eman is doing the art and the color, and I think you can see it in some of these images that look a little bit more painted. I find it interesting too whenever there's kind of a blend of flat color and paint, which has the earlier pages here had a little bit of that. Again, the cartoony stuff, you can see it in those sound effects and like a fight that is just a big cloud of action. It's classic cartoon language there. You know, this to me looks a little bit more like the traditional inked line art with somewhat flat color, and then you go next to it and see more of that painted quality. It's a fun mashup. You know, one of the things that I think makes Lobo work is how much almost rule breaking happens. You know, not just within the story, but even in the artwork. Being able to kind of combine like a flat traditional comic book look next to like a painted comic book look, it's not an easy thing to pull off. Lobo, Blazing Chain of Love. Here's another really good artist doing Lobo. This time it is Dennis Cohen. I don't even know where to begin if you're going to name Dennis Cohen. Probably Milestone Comics was a big piece, but his work goes back to the 70s. Did great work on The Question. Shared studio space with Bill Sienkiewicz, I think, in the 80s for a while. And just a really all-around accomplished good cartoonist. And no surprise, does a good Lobo. I really like his Lobo. You know, he's at this point he's 20 years into his into a career as a cartoonist and working at a high level, and it shows. I tend to, I think, overlook how popular Lobo was. Going back to do an interview about him, you realize like there must have been 30 miniseries and one-shots and stuff that came out in the 90s and all the way up to the 2000s, almost like momentum from that early 90s rise to success. And they mostly figured out the formula, you know, having artists like these guys that, you know, they could roll different artists through Lobo and keep it interesting and kind of a novelty and keep the series and the one-shots coming. So I didn't remember at the time just how long his popularity lasted, but it makes sense to me. I think the humor is really the piece that he had that everybody else missed. You know, they'd get compared to the other violent characters like Wolverine and Punisher and you know, these popular, I suppose, anti-heroes, but the humor, you know, like the cartooniness was the quality that a lot of those characters didn't have, and that was the piece that I think I really responded to in hindsight. So here's an interesting oddball novelty kind of book, Samurai by Aircell. That's Barry Blair's company, published in the 80s, mid to late 80s. Warlock 5 is a series that they published that I really liked a lot. It's amazing for the art. But also it's probably one of the most 80s-esque, it's a mashup of all kinds of like 80s-esque elements. The first 15 or so issues are drawn by this guy, Dennis Bovis. I'm probably messing up his last name a little bit, but really standout stuff. Definitely worth a Google search if you've never looked at Warlock 5. Again, like the first 13 to 15 issues, something like that, are really interesting, beautiful covers, airbrushed. So Aircell did a lot of stuff. Del Keown started there. They were a Canadian company. Dave Cooper did a lot of work from them. And Pat McKeown also worked for them and did some samurai stuff. And this, the reason I say this is interesting, if you can see, I don't know how well that's showing up, this is a thick book. This is a compilation. This is almost like a trade paperback, except, you know, before I guess they had that figured out. So it's just saddle stitched, but it's like 4 issues worth. Hey, Carlos Noel, thanks for the super chat, man. So Aircell is definitely the 80s black and white boom type company. You can see Barry Blair, Bruce Blair, probably some relative of Barry. That's not a name I've seen too much. And then Pat McKeown. Guang Yap did some stuff for Aircell as well. They published a lot of books, Aircell. And it's funny, their backstory is they were a heating and cooling company. And I don't know if there was a recession or something, but Barry Blair was an employee there and somehow pushed them into publishing comics, which, think about this. They were servicing furnaces and air conditioning units and installing them and doing like, in it's like an insulation company or something. And somehow, whenever business was bad, their solution was to make comics in the black and white boom of the 80s. Really bizarre. So, nevertheless, Samurai was one of their successful comics. I have several issues of Samurai. You know, as you can imagine, going through a black and white boom phase, I have picked up a lot of Aircel comics. You can always find these. Any box of comics that includes 80s indies, you'll probably find some Aircel comics. And of course, ninjas can't be too far behind a black and white comic. But the reason that I picked this one up in particular is just because of this giant, 150-page saddle-stitched format. Pretty unusual to see this stuff. I love these early like book collections. It was a long time before trade paperbacks became what they are now. That really, they've been around for a while, of course, but in terms of like mass production and being the standard in a lot of comics, that's a really new thing. And so early on, when people were trying to figure out how do you do this, how do you package this stuff, how do you get new readers, right? If once Samurai had been around for a year, it would be hard to find back issues. So you want to keep attracting new readers, put out a collection, but the collections are weird. Look at this guy's head gets sliced in half, just randomly in the middle of the page. So fun comics. There's sci-fi elements here. This is not like a historical comic or anything like that. Definitely like sci-fi. I think the main character is cloned and used in some ongoing war battles, something like that. Another black and white boom, New Beginning. This is another one of the post-apocalyptic type comics, which seem to be all the rage. Check this one out. Signed, numbered, number 1,129 of 5,000 copies. This is from 1990, but it's kind of the tail end of the black and white boom because there were a couple issues published before this one. I had read the first 2 issues I picked up somewhere. It reminds me a little bit of Ben Mara, although these get a little further removed from the Ben Mara stuff. The first couple issues are a little more raw, a little bit, probably maybe their first comics, the guys who were making these. And then you can see they get a little bit better, but there's a certain stiff quality to these things. These characters in particular really remind me of Ben Mara. And the story is, we're on the verge of like World War III. A group of people go into a bunker, to survive like nuclear war. And then they emerge at the end of issue 1. It's amazing, like you get all this group dynamics in the first issue while they're in the bunker and they're confined, and you get to learn who all the characters are. And then whenever they emerge, it's like, what are they going to find in this like Mad Max future world? And I didn't realize it, but there are 4 of these things, and I just learned that there is an issue 5 that is completed, and the guys who do this, I guess the writer who does this, has a comic book shop. And so a friend of mine, friend of the channel actually, Corey McDonald, has been interviewing him, and that's how I got this book, because I picked up issue 4 out of a quarter box like a year and a half ago, and I've been looking for issue 3 ever since, and Corey has been in touch with the creator and talking to them, and apparently they still have issues. And so he picked me up in issue 3, which is probably why it's signed. This is a pretty fun series. Out of those black and white books, the self-published books that get lambasted for being lousy, this is a pretty good series, pretty fun story. So I was psyched to complete my run of this and to find out that there is another one, hopefully in the works, that will wrap up the whole story and be kind of a complete piece. And who knows? Hopefully that'll come out soon. Oh man, so these are some comics that I picked up at 4-Color Fantasy. Big shout to Eric there, Eric and Steve and Mike, who brought me in for a Street Angel signing recently and had some comics that they had pulled. That's a store that's been around for 30 years in Winchester, Virginia. These stores that have been around that long, they, as you can imagine, have accumulated all kinds of comics, whether from buying collections from people or, maybe buying this stuff when it originally came out. These are actually older, from the 70s, so these even predate that store. I'm sure these came in some kind of collection. These are Christian comics. This one is not like, these are all part of Crusaders, which is Jack T. Chick. If you've ever seen like the small little tracks, the what are called Chick tracks, that's the same guy, same publisher behind these. These are just like full-size comics. Soldier of God feels like it could be part of that line, but it isn't. This is slightly different. This is 1982, and you know, I mean, I guess comics at the time, comics are for kids, and you know, if you're running a church or whatever, you're trying to reach kids. We've seen like picture Bibles and things like that that are designed for younger readers. So I think these guys are well intentioned in terms of spreading their beliefs, and they're trying to reach young people through what would have been a popular medium for young people at the time, comics. The Jack T. Chick stuff is noteworthy because it is like, man, it is hell and brimstone. This is eternal damnation is what's at stake in these Jack T. Chick comics. Pretty incredible coloring for that time period, I think. But these are, if you've never read a Jack T. Chick publication, definitely worth trying to track one down. And the Chick tracks used to be available everywhere. So, you know, you could find those pretty easily. I used to find those when I was a kid before I even read comics. And these comics do show up in, you know, they're printed in massive numbers, and you can see some of the other titles. Exorcist is one that we've looked at before in the past. I don't know if I have the arc or not, but that seems like that would be a good one. If you're into weird comics, these are definitely some comics that are outside of the normal range of comics. But again, look at the coloring on that. Like, what a sky, you know? This could be right out of Preacher. Wow. So I guess that's Scarface. All right, Jack T. Chick. A couple of anthologies. I believe these also came out of Four Color Fantasy. And these are, you know, black and white anthologies, sci-fi genre kind of stuff, horror anthology, and Comax. This is another Comax title. We've looked at a few of these. As far as I know, Butch Burcham is the like artist, writer, creative behind Comax. That was a publisher out of Chicago, say, I don't know, early, maybe 1990, something like that. They published a lot of these comics. Some were printed in interesting ways, like 1 or 2 colors. I think his wife, I believe, is the letterer, and she letters some other comics too, not just Comax. I've seen her name pop up in a few other credits. But they're relatively quickly drawn. I don't know if Burcham drew other comics. He seems very fast and accomplished, like he has some experience doing these. One of my favorites of his is a book called Doberman, and it's about a Doberman guard dog that's exposed to chemicals or something, think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and morphs into a person and has adventures. He also does, but he does a variety of these things. Demon Skull, there's fantasy stuff, good girl art, things like that. There's 15 or so Comax titles. I think most of them are just one-issue, one-shots. So Gore Shriek, their claim to fame, they're Fanico. That is a store in Albany, New York. I think it's still a store in Albany, New York. If you can't tell, this is from the 80s. Steve Bissette leads off here with this first story. It's dated 88. So besides being a store, I think they've organized conventions, and they've also published for a while, and published quite a bit of variety. Gore Shriek, horror anthology, hell of an image there. Greg Capullo got his start here. So this is a Greg Capullo cover, and there's a couple of Greg Capullo stories in here. This is not his. I like this artist. This is, I think his name is Rolf Stark. I don't know him from other places, although that name sounds familiar. And then I want to show off a little bit of this is neat. This is an article by Steve Bissette about monster magazines and horror comics. So that's pretty fun reading. And then there's a piece on Mars Attacks, who did these little tiny, if you can see this picture, they're like little mini comics, 54 comic book miniseries. These were sitting on the case at Ides the last couple of times I've been there. They bought them from a collection that came in. So if you're interested in these, last time I was there, they had them, and they're a couple bucks an issue or something like that. If that tickles your fancy. And then this is Greg Capullo art, and this is really cool. It's a wordless comic, and it's in this super tight grid. I'm gonna storyboards, until we see the perspective shift here. He has a couple of stories in this issue. We've looked at Gore Shriek before. See, the panels get way outside of that storyboard layout as it goes on, but man, that's nice, tight art. And I was wrong, it's not wordless. There's 3 words in it. This is another Fanico Tundra co-publication. And it is Kevin Eastman doing Zombie War. I don't know if there were more than 2 issues published or not, but story is Kevin Eastman and Tom Skolin. Art is Kevin Eastman and Eric Talbot. Lettering is April Eastman. And it kind of has that Turtles vibe. Certainly the duo shade paper is present there. And it's a big zombie comic. Don't know why this was done as a co-publication with Fanicore. Let's see if there's a date that might point us at some answers. 1992. I don't know if anything was going on with Mirage, if they were shutting down or slowing down or something, why they would partner with another publisher. But I guess 1993, I think, is when Image started doing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series that they published. So maybe something was going on with Mirage at the time. I'm really not sure. A1, this is an anthology, ran a couple of, I think it ran a couple of volumes. I believe this is volume 1, and this is your table of contents is on the back cover. The creators that are in this are unbelievable. Barry Windsor-Smith, Alan Moore, Gary Leach, Eddie Campbell, Phil Elliott, John Bolton, Ted McKeever, and Dave Gibbons. There are 2 stories by Ted McKeever and Dave Gibbons. 1 story Dave Gibbons writes and Ted McKeever draws, and 1 story Ted McKeever writes and Dave Gibbons draws. I love Ted McKeever. Dave Gibbons, obviously, as Watchmen. Ted McKeever I love from his work on Metropole and a lot of other series. Brian Boland, Alan Moore, Steve Parkhouse, Bill Sienkiewicz, Neil Gaiman, and Dave McKean. Like, come on, man. What a, it's a murderer's row of talent. So, all in black and white. This is the Barry Windsor-Smith story. I think this is the Gary Leach story. Really sharp stuff. Tight details. This is your Ted McKeever illustrated Dave Gibbons story here. Brian Boland, it's impressive. It's I don't know if it's all kind of a British theme. I guess a lot of these creators are coming out of the UK, not all of them, but many of them for sure. I'm going to show off some of the that's pretty nice. Glenn Fabry. It's Canon, C-A-N-O-N. I haven't read that story, so I'm not sure really what that means. When I see Canon in a comic, my first instinct is thinking of Wally Wood, but obviously this is a different kind of Canon. Flaming Carrot, Bob Burden, definitely not from the UK, but majority of these creators are UK based. So this is your Neil Gaiman, Dave McKean, and this is pretty early on in their comics careers. Let's see if I can find a year for this one. 1989, so pretty early on. Dave McKean certainly had not done a whole lot of comics that we would see in early days of something like Sandman, so not something we knew very well. And then, I don't know, I must have skipped the Bill Sienkiewicz somehow. This is a Bill Sienkiewicz piece. I don't know if he just did one page. Maybe he just did one page, like a cover to the Neil Gaiman story. I also, one of the things I found at 4Color, they had a bunch of adult boxes, and so I grabbed some of this stuff. You don't see a lot of adult comics, at least I don't see a lot of adult comics. I think it depends on, you know, where this stuff is shown. Like, so their thing is they don't want to put this out and just have kids going through it or whatever, so they had a couple of boxes there and they let me flip through it. This is interesting for me because it's Mike Diana. Mike Diana, around this time, like 1993, 1994, was he was charged in Florida with like creating and distributing or selling obscene materials. I don't know the exact charge, but he was found guilty, and one of the punishments was he was not allowed to draw legally after that. So that gets a lot of news. It was mentioned briefly in a wizard that we did. When I started getting into like underground comics, it was a big deal still in the early 2000s, the late 90s. As you can imagine, Comic Book Legal Defense Fund was heavily involved. There's been a documentary about Mike Diana recently. So I don't have any Mike Diana comics, maybe little anthology appearances here and there. Whenever I saw this was Mike Diana, I scooped it up just because noteworthy cartoonist, historically significant, and somebody that I am not, I don't have much. Frank Thorne has some artist editions out. I knew him from Red Sonja. Marvel published a Red Sonja comic. This is him. This is Frank Thorne here. I think there's some other photos of him. He's kind of a character. That's him. So he did Red Sonja for Marvel in the 70s, the first several issues, and he wrote and drew and lettered and colored it, which, you know, very few Marvel comics are produced that way. So that is something to seek out. You know, those were some, I remember buying those at Heroes Con out of a $1 box, and they're really good. Frank Thorne's really great, and seeing him do everything is pretty noteworthy. Some of this stuff is just random pickups. Mark Beecham, I believe Mark Beecham is somebody that Tim Vigil talks about in our Tim Vigil interview. I don't know if he came out of like the Neil Adams Continuity Studios. That's what I associate his style like, but I don't know if that's actually true or if it's just something I look at his art and see that connection. And so I think his art's pretty good. He doesn't do that many comics, or he'll do pieces of comics, and so I just grabbed that one. Whenever you're going through boxes of comics, you don't have a lot of time, so you know, if something catches your eye, if you think about it, you kind of have to make a move. This one, obviously I have a lot of the Faust comics. They've been published in different formats. This is a collection of issues 7 through 9, the Communion edition. I've never seen one of these collections. I've heard of them. I've seen them online. So whenever I saw this in the box, I was like, oh yeah, I should grab that. By the way, if you're looking for Faust comics, there were several Faust issues. That's a hell of a spread there. Pretty good example of Vigil at his best, I think. If you're looking for Faust comics, 4Color Fantasies had a few other issues, so you may want to reach out to them. You can find them in social media. It's not hard to get hold of those guys. They definitely had maybe half a dozen issues there. I picked this one up. This is Verotic is Glenn Danzig's line. I've bought these in the past. They're often good artists. I've bought comics from Verotic in the past that Simon Bisley draws. The reason I grabbed this one is Frank Terran, who did 2 issues of The Punisher that I really like. I think it's like issues 94 and 95. It's a 2-parter where Frank Castle has to team. He's in a fight club with a guy and ends up having to team up with that guy to escape the fight club. Frank Terran does not do very many interiors in comics as far as I know, and I did not know that he drew this, but whenever I saw his name, I grabbed it right up, and this is kind of indicative of what that Punisher comic looks like. It's pretty cool, that 2-issue Punisher comic, because they're in a fight club, like in a cage inside of a bar full of felons, and for some reason, everybody in the bar decides they're going to attack these 2 guys, and then it's Frank Castle teaming up with the other guy, having to fight his way through like a just a room full of hostile dudes while still sort of trying to kill each other. And then Debbie Does Dallas adaptation. This is from Aircell Comics after Aircell is acquired by Malibu. How about this guy? I've talked about wanting to do a Lobo versus Captain Marvel comic, and I would not be the first guy to do it. So cool Dan Brereton cover, and Barry Kitson interiors. A couple of Kayfabers pointed this out to me, and this was another one I was able to pick up at that 4-color signing. Pretty good store for back issues. Gotta love that, because not every store has back issues these days. But they have a good system too. I was able to actually show them my list, and they could find this stuff instantly, had a nice database for it. I'll do a flip through on, by request, a flip through of Debbie Does Dallas. I don't think this one is any great art. Nothing stands out to me. You know, this is not Tim Vigil art by any means, but nothing too special in there. Very cartoony. Kind of a strange license, but I don't know. Jet Authority #1. This is a mini comic, so there's a standard comic book size comparison for you. I think somebody sent us a copy of this for Cartoonist Kayfabe. I believe it came through probably an unboxing or a mail episode, and Ed won this in the coin flip. I thought this was a good looking book and was curious to see more of it. And obviously I could borrow Ed's. It's not like that coin flip is the end of us being able to see each other's comics. But I found this one in, I think this was from 4-Color Fantasy too. And since it was on my list, I was happy to come across it and pick it up. It's a really kind of peculiar object. 1996 is when it was made. Jonathan Hong is the creator, or at least the guy listed as copyright here. And I don't know, it's just a strange format. I like the cartooning. You know, there's some manga anime influence, but it's not that pronounced. So just an interesting looking comic and object. You know, it's a mini comic, but it's pretty well produced mini comic. I think it's offset printed, so pretty ambitious. Almost looks like something that would come out of like a Xeric award. All right, so picked up a bunch of Spawns. Well, maybe not a bunch. Picked up a few Spawns. I thought I had a few other issues of Spawn in here. I guess I don't. So I have been, I had purged my collection many, many years ago, and I kept the first dozen issues of Spawn, I guess, and then got rid of a few after that. And I've been, you know, since we've been looking at Todd McFarlane a lot more lately, I've been kind of watching for Spawns to pop back up. And I've pretty much filled up my Spawns up to issue 25 now, at least the McFarlane issues. And these were maybe the last couple that I picked up. You don't see Spawns I don't see Spawns as often in back issue, like $1.50 boxes, especially these early issues. I guess maybe there's still some demand for them. But I have slowly pieced together the issues I was missing. And I think that McFarlane probably peaks in that first dozen or so issues of Spawn for me. And then after that, you know, he does the Spawn Batman crossover. It's okay. I was disappointed in it at the time. It's kind of cool as a novelty object. But when he returns to Spawn, it feels like he's starting up maybe McFarlane Toys. He had been on top for so long. I don't think that the second year of Spawn is as strong as the first year. This one I would put in first year. You know, it's still issue 13. It's still before the Batman crossover. Good stuff. Pretty cool. This is the Chapel crossover that gets into Spawn Origins and, you know, crossover with Chapel from Rob Liefeld. So that's pretty fun. But when you get to like Spawn 21 to 24, let's say, Greg Capullo comes on, I think for one or two of those issues he's credited. Mark Pennington is credited as inker on this issue. And it just feels like McFarlane's a little bit, I don't know, spread thin, or maybe he had a bunch of ideas stored up for that first year and now it's kind of like playing out the thread. And by the way, the difference in quality is very minimal. You know, I'm not suggesting that these are hackneyed or much less than that first year. But I think if you're looking very closely, I find that first year a little bit more energetic than this last little bit. But I still pick up current comics from time to time, and this is your Spawn number 300. If you haven't picked this up, it's pretty interesting. Greg Capullo does pencils, McFarlane Inks, which was a long-time successful team on Spawn. I think I know some of my friends, that's their favorite Spawn run, is with McFarlane finishing Greg Capullo's pencils. But there are chapters in this one by different artists. McFarlane does one chapter completely. J. Scott Campbell pencils one chapter, which is kind of wild to me that J. Scott Campbell is doing an issue. He doesn't do a lot of comics anymore. Gen 13, obviously, and Danger Girl, probably his two biggest properties, best known work. And I like J. Scott Campbell, so it's kind of cool to see him doing a little bit of work. I don't know what his association is with Spawn, if it was just somebody that McFarlane recruited or what. Kind of neat to see a Spawn comic. I haven't bought any Spawn comics since the Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane team-up issues, so it's kind of cool to revisit. And this is some of the J. Scott Campbell stuff with McFarlane inking over top. Kind of neat. And you even have some behind-the-scenes information back here where you can see Greg Capullo pencils, Todd McFarlane inks, colors, lettering. Tom Warzakowski still lettering. Man, I dig Tom Warzakowski letters. This is the New Mutants relatively recent issue, and it was Chris Claremont and Bill Sienkiewicz coming back to do that stuff. So one of my favorite runs is that original New Mutants, Bill Sienkiewicz, Chris Claremont team up. Kind of cool to see them back together. Nice to see Bill Sienkiewicz doing a full issue interiors. I don't think he's coloring this, although I could be wrong. No, it's Chris Sotomayor, color artist. But nevertheless, great to see Bill Sienkiewicz back in a regular issue. Cool seeing him return to these characters also. This is one I picked up from SPX, Abby James, Emotional Data. So again, I'm not just looking at old comics. This one is published by Silver Sprocket, who I showed off a couple other books when we did our SPX recap. Catboy was one that Silver Sprocket, I believe, published. And I like this stuff. This is much more indie alternative style. All right, so somebody asked for the Walter Simonson poster from Spawn. I don't know what issue that is. Is that 13? I have no problem doing requests here. Spawn poster by Walt Simonson. This is from issue 13. McFarlane used to often have these centerfold posters. I'm getting some glare on it, unfortunately. I don't know if I can do much about the glare, but yeah, Simonson's a favorite here as well, for sure. All right, I'm gonna have to kind of skip through these a little bit quickly. So G.I. Joe Yearbook number 3. This is an interesting one because this is like a, it's called Hush Job. Everybody knows G.I. Joe 21 is the famous wordless issue. This is like a sequel follow-up. I was unaware of this and just randomly happened upon it, flipping through this comic from a bin and was like, what is this thing exactly? So some really nice pages and artwork. The G.I. Joe 21 is actually, the pencils are by Larry Hama. In this case, Ron Wagner is doing the pencils, not Larry Hama. But it's the same, like I said, basically a sequel. So we get Storm Shadow, Scarlet, Snake Eyes infiltrating a Cobra base and having ninja fights, all without words. I don't know if all of you knew this existed or not. I did not, so there's your heads up, man. Everybody knows G.I. Joe 21 is the wordless comic. G.I. Joe Yearbook #3, also wordless comic, reteaming the same cast from that famous issue 21. Here's some fun. Banner, 4-issue miniseries, Brian Azzarello and Richard Corbin. Is there a guy who sounds like a better artist for the Hulk than Richard Corbin? Corbin did several of these. He did a Cage series. He did Punisher: The End. He just had like a run of Marvel comics that he did in the 2000s, and this Hulk one is part of that run. So pretty cool to see the great Richard Corbin taking on the Hulk, and does a nice mean green version of the Hulk as well. Sometimes, depending on where a character is at, you don't always get the prime version of that character. And in this case, you know, this is pretty classic Hulk material. The green angry version of the Hulk, my favorite version of the Hulk. And you get to see Corbin applying his veins and musculature and horror. It's a good fit. It's a monster comic by Richard Corbin, you know. How can you go wrong with that? Here's an odd one. The Art of Akira, Volume 1. I saw this listed somewhere, and whenever I finally came across it in a back issue bin, I had to grab it. You know, we've done a couple of episodes dedicated to Akira and Otomo. This is like screen captures, I guess. Although they're listed as prices, so it's almost a catalog of like cell animation art that you could buy. It's a shame that it's in black and white. You know, it's not the best way to view this artwork for sure, but it's a strange object. Let's put it that way. You know, I mean, comics are full of these kind of oddball books and issues and things, and I would definitely put this in the same category. You get to see some character designs. That's pretty nice. But this is focused on the anime, on the movie, much more so than the original manga. And mostly, I would just, you know, say this is just a weird object. It's Streamlined Pictures is where to order these, so I guess you can actually order these. These character model sheets, $100. It's like a catalog, I guess, you know, the Art of Akira animation art catalog featuring over 200 illustrations from the classic Japanese animation film, high quality reproductions. I don't know if that high quality reproduction is referring to the artwork that's in this catalog. I guess it must be, because if you're paying $400 or $500 for animation cell art, you're not buying the reproduction of the cell art for that price, I don't think. Anyway, weird book. Not the best production quality, unfortunately, but I don't know. Like I said, I can't pass this stuff up whenever I come across it for a buck or 50 cents, because who knows when you'll ever see anything like that again. I always buy Amazing Heroes whenever I find them cheap. I love Amazing Heroes. It's kind of like the 1980s version of Wizard magazine in a lot of ways. This was the mainstream superhero counterpart to the Comics Journal. It was also published by Fantagraphics. And I have most of the 1986 issues. This one is actually January 1st, 1987. But I would count that as 1986 on a technicality, because it was clearly all produced in 1986. How great is this Ginger Fox ad? Ninja, 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 ninja. Illustrated by Mitch O'Connell, too. Great, great illustrator. Has done very few comics. I mentioned him earlier this episode because he would do Terminator covers for First's Terminator series. Not all the covers, but many of them. This is one of the few comics that he did, Ginger Fox, World of Ginger Fox. So, editorial by Fantagraphics co-publisher Kim Thompson, the late Kim Thompson. And the great part of this issue, besides my infatuation with the year 1986 when it comes to comics, is it features Scott McCloud's Destroy, which is one of those great comic books. And I figure if I ever actually do a 1986 zine, or if we do a series on 1986 comics, you can bet we will cover Destroy. And like I said, it's January 1st, 1987 cover date, but realistically, this is mostly 1986 information. So, all right. I know there's some Stephen Platt fans out there watching. Image used to do ash can editions of their comics, and that is what you see here. So these would be produced in black and white printing on like a one color, a cover that is a different color, and then the interiors are black and white. And they were just, I don't know if they were photocopied or not, because they would do them in quantities of thousands. Like they might do 5,000 of these things. I assume you should do them offset if you're printing that many, but they do have a certain photocopy like quality, especially like you can see there, although that's pixelated. So I don't know how these things are made. I think they should be done as offset because of the quantities. I also don't know how many of these were printed. Sometimes they're signed and numbered. I have a Pit one. I might have a Cyberforce. I think everybody was doing these. I have a Cybernary Deathblow #1, so Wildstorm and Jim Lee was doing them. I have 1 or 2 issues that Pitt did. They're very interesting objects. Tribe, I think, had one. I think there was one from 1963. You can find these on eBay, and they usually go for, I don't know, $20 or up to maybe $100. Like there's a 1963 one that looks really cool, but I can't quite pull the trigger on that one. And if you look closely, you can see the dotted lines. So these are reproductions from like the original art, not a colored version, not a cleaned up version, because they have like the crop lines or these dotted lines. They have full bleed lines. And it just gets absurd. We've talked about Stephen Platt in this particular issue. This is his first issue of Prophet. This was a very highly anticipated issue, and it is just unreadable at this size. I mean, look at that. It's madness. And the madness continues. So this is what we were excited about with Stephen Platt. Absurd levels of detail, and you can see it all on display in this ash can. Vanity Floppy #1. This is by Carl Stevens. Carl Stevens was a Xeric winner, very good cartoonist, active on social media, still making comics, does a bunch of stuff for New Yorker magazine, has a photorealistic style both in color and black and white. And this is kind of exactly what it says, Vanity Floppy. This is, Carl Stevens is a guy that we have been in touch with. We're fans of his work. And I believe this is just his love of comic books, wanting to make a comic book. It's not, this is a new issue. This is not necessarily financially the best format. He does graphic novels. Like I said, he does stuff from New Yorker, really celebrated cartoonist. And this is him expressing his love of making comics, plain and simple. Well worth seeking out his work. Give him a follow on social media because he posts a lot of comics there. So if you're impressed by this work, I would definitely say, track him down and follow him, because the stuff that he posts is phenomenal, and you can see he's very impressive both in color and black and white. He's good with series, he's good with graphic novels, long stories, short form, and single panels. I'm a fan, as you can tell from this gushing review, and super excited that he took the time to make a comic book in this day and age. So pretty cool. 2019. Published by Kilgore, who they publish quite a few alternative comics, and they still kind of put out this comic book format style, like one-man anthologies and things, or one-person anthologies, and definitely worth giving a look. So Kilgore Books and Carl Stevens. Shadow of the Groundhog, #1, October 1986. I don't know if I buy this if it doesn't have 1986 printed on the cover, but what a weird object. $1.11? $1.11. Anyway, let's take a closer look at this thing. This is a comic out of Alabama. As far as I know, I only have one other book that was published from Alabama. So not a big comics community as far as I know there. I don't know what the population of Alabama is like either. It may not be a very populous state. I really don't know. But this is a comic from there. It reminds me a lot of Rory Hayes, an underground cartoonist. There have been a couple collections of Rory Hayes comics. The late Rory Hayes died very young, but he did these comics featuring a character that looked like a teddy bear, and there's a certain similar quality to this. These are somewhat vengeful groundhogs. I think what happens is a groundhog is killed or kidnapped or something, and then these groundhogs come to exact revenge, let's say. Very strange. And then like 2-color printing on some of it. You see the red there for the blood. There's some almost parody-like elements where this character is, you know, sort of like Wolverine and a badass fighter and stuff. Blood on the claws. This amuses me because my friend John is a fan of groundhogs. So John P. of King Cat Comics. So I've actually found a couple more of this comic. Since I picked this one up, I've found it in a few other places, which is just bizarre. Like 1986, totally the height of the black and white boom, and I think whatever distribution this thing had is a result of that time period. Right place, right time for Shadow of the Groundhog. All right, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap this up very soon. I ran into a vein of manga at one of these back issue dives, and this is Bayo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not, by Hirohiko Araki. This is a Viz comic published in the, I believe, late 80s. Ed had posted an image of this character. So this is originally published in 1984, published in the States in 1989. And the story of this character is he's a bioweapon. This company has like some parasite that they put into people's brains that activates all kinds of like super weapon, almost cyborg action. You know, if the character's threatened or injured or gets into some kind of combat, it activates. The parasite takes over the character. This cartoonist, look at this great like cyborg face. This cartoonist is known for JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, but Ed had come across the first appearance of this, which was his first serial. It predated JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, and I think Ed wasn't sure like why this was notable. I can't remember if it was an expensive issue, the first appearance, or what, but he was kind of like curious about it. It made me think of this character, and so I started looking for it whenever I would get into back issue stuff, and it's great. It's fun. I guess it maybe didn't sell well, at least not in the United States, but it's out there. Some of the later issues are a little bit harder to find because sales were down, but I don't know that there's a big demand for it. There was an anime, I think 1 volume of an anime. It's really fun cartooning. I don't know if it's outlaw exactly, but it's kind of on the edge. You know, it's fighting and violence and, like I say, a bioweapon. So it's kind of close to outlaw, if not totally outlaw. It's a fun series. Only 8 issues published. I don't know if there were collections or not. I don't know if there are collections or not, but these exist, and I was very happy to track them down, and it was a very fun read of this character escaping from the government lab, going on the lam, and then the bounty hunter-like people that are sent after him, or bounty hunter-like characters, I suppose. All right, I got to wrap it up here for now, unfortunately. I did not get through the whole stack of comics, so I probably got through the best of them, though. I was cherry picking there at the end. Anyway, thank you guys for joining me. Hope wherever you're at, you're having a great day, a great Sunday, and thank you very much, man. Keep watching, stay tuned, and I probably will leave this video go live, so spread the word. As always, like, follow, and subscribe. Be sure and hit the bell icon at the bottom of these videos because they will notify you when we post new videos, and they'll notify you whenever we're streaming stuff like this video this morning. You can find Cartoonist Kayfabe merchandise at our spread shop. There's a link below our videos to that. And tell a friend about Cartoonist Kayfabe. Stay tuned for more, and thank you all very much.